Hi, so for this session we'll do a few practice questions for our test and it won't go for too long. So with our first question, we're being asked to divide a decimal with a whole number 7. So the first step, just to make sure you don't get confused, is write this in fraction form, 0.5789, and we know the fraction line, the vinculum, means divide. Divide by 7. And the reason for this is you can clearly see which one falls down and goes under the bridge. And also we know our divisor, which is the bottom number, has to be a whole number. 7 is a whole number, so I don't have to worry about changing it into a whole number. The top, we can see, yes, there's a decimal. This does not have to be a whole number because we know that with our next step, we get our bridge ready, we have under the bridge we have 0.5789 and out here we have 7. And you can see that decimal is visible. Just put the decimal on top, straight above, and start dividing. 7 into 0, can it go? No, nothing to carry on. 7 into 5, it can't fit, can it? So a 0 goes here as well. We haven't used a 5, so now it gets carried on to the 7, and we have 57. How many times can 7 fit into 57? Well, I know that 7 times 8 is 56, so that can fit in 8 times, and remainder 1. 7 into 18, 7 times 2 is 14, so that's twice. Remainder 4, so 4 can go on to the 9. And 7 into 49, that can fit in evenly 7 times. And that's it. So our final answer, we'll write it down here, is 0.0827. And of course you can check using your calculator. It's a finite decimal, which means it doesn't go on forever. It just stops at that 7. Now with our next problem, yes, we are dividing, but you notice that we have 2 decimals. So straight away I know that we are going to have to turn the bottom number, the divisor, into a whole number. To make sure we know which one's the divisor, write this in fraction form. 0.54 divided by 0.06. And now, before we get our 0.54 under the bridge, we know we have to make the bottom number a whole number. And we know the trick, to make this into a whole number, how many places does my decimal have to move? 1 and 2. That means I times it by 1 and 2 zeros. 2 places, 2 zeros. And what we do to the bottom, we must do to the top. And this will also move 1, 2. So I will end up with 54 divided by, because now the decimal's here and the decimal's here, so 54 divided by 6. We know the decimal point is really invisible, so that's why we don't see the decimal point anymore. And have a look, what's 54 divided by 6? Do I need my bridge? Well, you can use your bridge, but knowing your timetables, 54 divided by 6, that is just 9. And we're done. So now we'll do a question on rounding off. So for example, I'll put a decimal up quickly, 1.2853, and we'll do one more, we'll do the hardest one possible, 9999. All right, so let's read the question properly. Round off the following to 2 decimal places, okay? So a keyword, decimal places. We know decimal places means numbers after the decimal point, okay? So in this case, we've got 4 decimal places, and they are 2, 8, 5, and 3. Down here, we also have 4 decimal places. So it's asking us to round off to how many decimal places? To 2. So your first step is, well, there's my decimal point. We'll count 2 decimal places. We've got 1 and 2. That means we're cutting off everything from this line. So we don't want the 5 and 3 there. And with the question 2 down here, let's do the same thing, cutting off everything from this line here. So we can see we're going to end up with 2 decimal places. But before we just chop everything off, we're going to do our check. And that is, if we're rounding off here to 2 decimal places, there's our 8. So the number after it is a 5. So this is what we call the critical digit. This will tell us whether we round up or down. And we know if we round up, we add a 1 to the 8. And if we round down, it just stays the same. And to know whether to round up or down, check this number here. What number do you see? It's a 5. And we know if it's 5 or more, we add a 1 to round up. If it's 4 or less, we just leave it. And 8 plus 1 is just 9. So this will equal 1.29. And it's got 2 decimal places. The 2 and the 9 are 2 decimal places. Done. This one down here is really the hardest one you can ever get. And that is, there's our cutoff line. We've got 9 and 9 that are the same number, but there are 2 decimal places. So critical digit, is it 5 or more? Yes, it is. So we add a 1 to this 9, okay? And this is where you now have to use your addition skills. Now, I'll get my decimal ready in the same spot. 9 plus 1 is 10. Now, we don't write 10. We put a 0 down and we carry the 1. 9 plus 1 is 10 again. Put the 0 down and carry the 1. 1 plus 1 is 2. So for this one, to round it off to 2 decimal places, we just actually end up with a whole number, 2. Okay? And that's because 0.999 or 1.999 is so close to 2 that rounding up, you end up with your whole number. Okay? So just remember, if it says to, just say it said to 3 decimal places or 4, you would count 1, 2, 3 decimal places or 1, 2, 3, 4 and then do your cutoff line. Our next revision question is on multiplying decimals. And to do this, your first step is forget about the decimals. Write the numbers. So if I didn't have a decimal here, so I'm going to write them again and I'll show you what I mean. So 1.2 times 0.08. Without a decimal, imagine they weren't there for now. We have 12. And over here, we've got 008. Do we have to have these zeros in front of the 8? No. So all we're going to do is now have 12 times 8. Now this is actually an easy one because we know our timetables. Just say you forgot what 12 times 8 was. Well, 8 times 2 is 16. Put the 6 down, carry the 1. 8 times 1 is 8 plus 1 is 9. And we know 8 times 12 is 96. But we don't stop there, of course. Where is our decimal now with this 96? We know it's actually invisible and it's here. And it's going to have to move depending on how many decimal places there are in the question. So let's have a look. 1.2 has 1 decimal place. 0.08 has 1 and 2 decimal places. Even though there's a 0 here and 0 has no value, it's still a decimal place. 0's in the tens column, 8's in the hundredths. So altogether we have 1, 2, 3 decimal places, or 1, 2, 3 numbers after the decimal. And that's how many times we'll move this decimal back. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to add in an extra 0. I'll put in 2, just so I don't have to worry about filling in empty spaces, because sometimes that can confuse people. So we're going to move it back 3 times. 1, 2, and 3. So my decimal goes in there. So our final answer, let's move from here. We have 0.096. Done. Okay, and like I said, just check with your calculator, but that's all you have to do. Forget about the decimal, multiply it as you normally would, and then move the decimal back depending on how many decimal places there are. Okay, our last 2 questions. You notice we have percentages. Here we've got 12% and here we have 1/4%. Now, we'll start with our 12%, and what the question is asking us to do is to turn these into fractions, okay? And what we mean by fractions is fractions that don't have the percentage symbol. So we want this percentage symbol to disappear. Now for the first one, we know that it's pretty straightforward. 12%, to write it as a fraction, is what? 12 out of 100. And when we simplify this, divide them both by 4. 12 divided by 4 is 3. 100 divided by 4 is 25. And there's our simplified fraction. 12% without a percentage in fraction form is 3 out of 25. And the reason why we want to know what the fraction is without a percentage is, just say we said 12% of people have very bad breath, okay? And we wanted to know what numbers that represented in real life. Well, it's saying 3 out of 25 people have bad breath. So 25 people relates to a classroom size. So you can imagine in your classroom, according to this result, there are 3 people in your class out of 25 students, 3 of them will have bad breath. All right, and hopefully that's not the case. Now, having with the first one, you notice that what actually happened was that 12% became 12 out of 100. And what actually happened was that 12 was really over a 1, wasn't it? And so what you've got to do is this percentage, you're actually saying we're multiplying the bottom by 100 to get 12 out of 100. Okay, that's another way of looking at it. So when it comes to 1/4%, now I know some of you have thought, oh, this is just 25%, because we know a quarter is the same as 0.25, and 1/4%, yeah, it's 25%. But be very careful. This is already a percentage. So 1/4% is saying it's actually less than 1%. Okay, so it's a bit different. It's not 25%. Okay, 1/4% is less than 1%. So way less than 25%. Now, the problem with this is, if you go to put this on the bottom, we end up with something like this. 1/4 and then out of 100. Okay? Because we know this percentage symbol means out of 100. And this is actually correct, what we've done here. But it looks totally confusing. Okay? To show you what actually happens is this bit here, we know the vinculum, this line is saying divided by 100. We can write this, instead of out of 100, we can write it like this, divide by 100. Okay? And then using our fraction skills, to turn this into times, that 100 over 1, we simply flip it, and we end up with, I'll squeeze it in here, 1/4 times 1 over 100. And then finally, we end up with, well, 1 times 1 is 1, and 4 times 100 is 400. Okay? Now, that is a long way of doing it. The shortcut is the same thing that we did above. And that is, all you have to do to get rid of the percentage is times the bottom number by 100. So if I had 1/4%, I'll write it up here again. To get rid of this symbol, just times the 4 by 100. So we end up with 1 over 400. And that's all you have to do. And that works with any percentage. You can either write it out of 100, or you can just times the bottom number by 100. So just quickly, if we had just say 2%, we know that 2 is really sitting on a 1. So all we have to do is, the way we know is, well, 2% means 2 out of 100, which is correct. And then you simplify it. But the other way of looking at it is, this means to times the bottom by 100. And we still get 2 out of 100. Okay? So the only time we have to actually remember that is when we end up with a fraction that's a percentage. That's where you times the bottom by 100. Okay? And then simplify where you can. But that's more of a challenge question. So if that just confused you, don't worry about it. Just keep practicing other work, because that will be in the challenge section, and I'll explain it to you another time. Thank you.